Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm really delighted today to be welcoming Vona Groarke, who I have only met today, but I feel I know her very well because I've taught her wonderful book to many, many different people. In fact, we were just saying I've taught it as part of the master's C course option here in Oxford in life writing, and master's students have absolutely loved it and found enormous amounts. And I've taught it to groups, reading groups in the general public who've also loved it and found enormous amounts in it. So it's a huge pleasure to be able to talk to her about it and hear her talk about it today. Vona has published 14 books with the Gallery Press, including 9 poetry collections, 2 translations from the Irish, most recently Woman of Winter. I suspect that's not most recently anymore, is it? I suspect there's even more recently than that, which is a version of the much-loved Irish poem, usually known in English as The Lament of the Hag of Beer. She published Hereafter, The Telling Life of Ellen O'Hara, with New York University Press, and New York will doubtless come up a lot, and published this in 2022. She was a Cullman Fellow of the New York Public Library, which was the point at which she wrote this, former editor of Poetry Ireland Review and selector of the UK's Poetry Book Society. She's taught at the University of Manchester since 2007. She is the current writer in residence at St John's College, Cambridge, where a colleague of mine told me that they are trying every possible excuse to keep her indefinitely because they all love her so much. So that may continue. And lives in County Sligo in the west of Ireland and in London. And she is now the Ireland Professor of Poetry and also has been shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, which I believe is breaking news. So thank you so much. Vona is going to talk for 10 minutes or so and show us some images about the book, and then we will have a chat and throw it open to all of you as well. So Vona, thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming along and to be interrogated by Kate, whose work I admire so much, is a real honour and pleasure for me as well. So rather than just talk about the book in the abstract, I thought it might be no harm to kind of show you a little bit, maybe about 10 minutes or so, of the various ingredients of the book, so you can see the movement between poetry, lyric prose, kind of more reportage, history, images, etc. Okay, so it's a short extract. It's from the beginning, so I'm not even going to attempt to cover the whole arc of the book. But what I would like to do in the first 10 minutes is to give you a sense of the form of the book, if you like, rather than the whole narrative or as I said, the arcs. So, okay, off we go. Right, Glenavue, County Sligo, where you come from. That Glenavue, Glanavua in the Irish language, could mean either glen of ghosts or glen of hatred is not lost on me. Fua, literally form, shape, phantom, spectre, second meaning hate or hatred. I conjure you out of the single fact that once you lived, and the living was done for the most part here, in this city, New York, where I'm living for the term of a fellowship at the Cullman Center in the New York Public Library. I didn't come to write about you, but somewhere along the line, out of casual curiosity, I start in on you, Ellen O'Hara, and once I do, I'm hooked. My mother knew you when she was a child, before she left to live in Ireland. You were in her stories, but I have no concrete evidence, no photograph, diary, letter, document, no object I know for sure passed through your hands. My job in this, it seems clear to me, is to find a way to answer for what is known and what is not. To do so, I will need guardrail prose, but I will also need language that cross-stitches and embroiders itself the way poetry often does. There will be fact and doubt and speculation, there will be imagining. Why take it on, this story? Why set myself on a trail of scattered research crumbs, no end in sight, maybe no end possible, that could account for all these words? You see an orange on a gate pillar in the countryside. You can't help yourself. You're wrapping it in narrative to take away with you. Who gave it to her, why he did, why she didn't eat it, and why she decided to leave it just there. Story is company. Being here. My great-grandmother stops by today to check in on me. She makes tea from leaves and bids me drain it quickly, for once in my life not to speak. Looking into the cup, she tells me to buy a bicycle, grow my hair and wear it up. That a man I don't know thinks ardently of me, that number 6 will be significant, and that I should have my eyes checked. It seems she gets by fortune telling on the other side. No version of the future, she says, is wasted on the dead. It's true my eyes have been feeling the strain of hour on hour screen gleaning for verifiable facts. I started with no more than her name. Now I have a list of questions to put to her that she doesn't seem to be frank, inclined to answer. She tilts the leaves, examining, but gives no more commands, then gons herself into thin air. The small white cup remains. I'm trying to look behind you, to what was at your back, to what moulded and decided you and trimmed, as if you were some sort of ghost to be seen clean through. I hadn't thought of this as a famine story, but of course it is. Austin, your father, was born in 1831, Anne, your mother, in 1835. They were of an age by the time of the Great Famine, 1845 to 52, to experience it firsthand and irrevocably. Who knows what the nature of that experience might have been, how it might have inflected their house and 12 children growing up in the shadow of that catastrophe. It wasn't hunger that drove me here, though that wasn't so for some. Our small holding was more or less sufficient when good harvest came, and enough of us to make good headway with hard work on the land. But every home is different, and not always blessed with willing hands or a fair wind. 3 years before I left for here, there was a bad harvest, famine, fever, like in Black 47, a foul smell, the Tuppercurry workhouse built for 500, crammed with 8, more on the roadside, more still on the ships to America, out of sight of the graveyard. It was an autumn harvest of strange noises on the wind, a punch of heat or a veil of cold that could not be explained, a patch of shadow you'd walk on and feel chilled to the bone, cries and pleas for help from children where there were none. My father, who'd lived through it all before and worse, said he saw no life worth living in a place so cursed. I can't give you much else. People hated to talk about it. Mama and Dada would bless themselves and remain mute as stones if we asked. You'd almost swear they were untrue, the stories we learned listening to the wind wheedle names from gaps and clumps of stones where houses used to be, or picking out lazy beds, poking through the skin of farms where people lived and ate and tended crops that closed over the past, but the land remembered if people refused. Now and then, a name followed by God rest her soul, or a patch of road hurried past when there was no call. The field with no cross, said to be brimming with dead, thin bones rattling when a rook alit, if you listened hard. A shard of cup seen in a ditch where no cup ought to be. Silence to fill a church if we asked. Did any of us die? Forgot about that. Okay.
Wire yourself up.
Fine.
Thank you so much for that. It's one of the wonderful things that is so fascinating for us as life writers about this book are these different registers that you use all the time, and that's a wonderful little whistle-stop tour of some of the different voices that we encounter in the first few pages. So wonderful to have it. Thank you. Now, I think we should wheel back to what this book is actually about and how it came about. Can you take us back to the New York Public Library and what you thought you were going to do, and then what you actually did do?
So I had submitted a project that was to do with another great interest of mine, which is letterpress printing. And I was going to write poems about the letterpress printed poetry collections of the NYPL. And I was given an office and I was set up. And after about 3 weeks, I thought, I've never written poems like this in my life, where I go to work at 10 o'clock in the morning and I leave at 6 with a poem. I thought, I actually can't do it. You know, nothing was happening. And so I thought, well, I better come up with something else pretty quickly. So, I mean, as I said in one of the pieces I read out, it kind of happened accidentally so this woman, Ellen O'Hara, is my great-grandmother. And my mother had lived with her. So my mother was born in 1924 and had lived with her grandmother, as was not an infrequent occurrence, that she was kind of farmed out slightly as the eldest child out to live with her grandmother, who ran this little boarding house in New York. And then when my mother was 12, her father won a pub in a poker game. And the pub, well, that's the story anyway. That's the story that we've been told. I think there are other ways to come by pubs, but that was the story. And so anyway, in 1936, the family upped and moved back to Ireland, and my mother never saw her grandmother again. But she used to talk about her a lot. So when I was thinking, right, what connections do I have with New York? Well, I have one. I have a storied connection. I have this figure of somebody who was like a ghostly figure in my youth that my mother used to tell me stories about all the time. So I thought, well, I wonder what I can find out about her. And of course, the answer is not a great deal. So I thought, okay, is that a dead end, or can I actually do something with the holes in the story? She didn't own property. The records that I have of her are official records. They're passenger lists from ships. They are marriage certificates, birth certificates for her 2 children, death certificate. She was in Polk's directory at one point with her little boarding house, but very little, very little. And as I said in one of the pieces, I don't have a photograph. Don't know what she looked like. So I had to conjure her to see if I could do anything with this personage, So I thought, okay, I'm going to make her up. I'm going to imagine that she's sitting in that other chair that's in my office. And then once I've made that decision, how does she sound? Does she sound American? Does she sound like she's from Sligo? What's she going to talk about? What's her tone going to be? Is she going to be really helpful, or is she going to be like, nah, don't think so. So I had to make all these decisions about her as this created fictional character, but I didn't want it to be fiction, because I'm not a fiction writer and I don't have the patience for it. So my next big decision was I could tell the story of all the women, or of, that kind of life that happened to women like Ellen. Mm-hmm. And this I can get information for, because there's lots of research and lots of really good scholarly publication on subjects like the emigrant ships, the experience at Castle Garden, which was the forerunner to Ellis Island, what the building was like, what the noise level was like. There's first-hand accounts of all of that, and there's very good scholarly research. The whole thing, how did you get hired as a domestic servant? What kind of a job were you likely to have? What were your work conditions? How much pay? What did you do with that pay? So there's quite a lot of really good research on all of those aspects of it. So I thought, actually, do you know what? I think there is a story here to be told. It's not necessarily Ellen's story particularly, but it is the story of an experience that I know from life that she had. And I know that she ended up with this little boarding house for Irish navvies, basically, and I know that my mother helped her out there. So how did she get there? How did she get from being one of 12 children on a 15-acre farm in really awful land in South County Sligo to having this little boarding house? There's only one way she could have done it, really, which was through starting off as a domestic servant and through learning how you manage food, economy, how to clean a floor, because they didn't have those kind of floors in the kind of house that she grew up in, so she had to learn everything. So that's what I spent my year doing, was finding out what she would have learned and finding out how she would have lived, and just picking up the breadcrumbs on the trail, really.
It's the most incredibly brave project. We have people who come to us at the Life Writing Centre all the time saying, I really want to write about my grandmother or my great-grandmother, and there's a great story, but there are too many gaps. We don't have any letters from her between 1917 and 1919. I think they don't know they're born. I mean, to write a biography of someone with no photographs of them,
yep.
where you have, as you say, you can list the documentation on one hand. Yep. That is going where angels fear to tread, isn't it? That's quite a project. And while I glibly tell people to kind of use the gaps as a creative opportunity, you are the leader in the field of doing that.
But I have an advantage because I'm a poet. So I was able to think, right, so if I was an historian, I would have given up, right? If I was a biographer, I think I would have given up. So what I was able to do was think, okay, how is there a way that being able to do what I'm able to do and what I've spent my writing life so far doing, is there some way that I can apply those skills to the story that I have? And I thought, well, of course there is. Of course there is. So I can use poetry. And I wasn't sure that it would be this to begin with, but I can use poetry to try and create her voice, to give her a solid, discernible voice that is different from the voice of the researcher in the book, who's like a version of me, but not exactly me. So she's going to have to write in this kind of lyric prose, and she's going to have to think about, I'm on a hiding to nowhere, it's not going to work, it's so hard, I keep rubbing up against dead ends, etc. So she'll go through all of that, but in the meantime, I need a contrasting voice. Well, I can use poetry for that. Mm-hmm. So if I have two lots of prose, then it's going to be tricky to get enough of a gap between them that you have tension and therefore drama. But if you use poetry, which is the thing that I was able to bring to the story, I thought, well, actually, I think I can get this sense of drama.
And so you chose the sonnet,
yeah.
Which you describe as a folk sonnet,
yeah.
which is a new form on me. I mean, is that a thing?
Well, it's very loose, so it's not, as you probably saw from the ones that I projected there, it's not metrically correct.
Right.
It does use, they all use a rhyming scheme, but it's always half rhyme. Sometimes there's a full rhyme, but very seldom, because I really don't trust full rhyme. But there's a lot of half rhyme, a little bit of para rhyme, but there's some kind of rhyme scheme going on in it. But I needed her to sound different, I've already said that, but also I thought, okay, so what I know of this woman is that she was a housekeeper in various formats. So she was neat. I thought, well, okay, if she's going to talk to me, I think I want her to give her a neat form. So I'll give her the sonnet, and we'll see how that works, and then we'll structure it around these loose rhymes and roughly equal line lengths, though not metrically correct. And we'll try it out in different sonnet forms. And then the one that I use mostly is the Italian sonnet, which is 8 and 6, and it's got this, what they call the volta in the middle. And I thought the volta is good because it's one gap, whereas in the English sonnet you've got 3 gaps. But one gap draws attention to the fact that it's a gap, whereas 3, your eye kind of elides over them. But 1, you think, okay, what has changed between the end of that first stanza and the start of the second? And that idea of change happening in silence and in the absence of words seemed to me to fit with what I was doing.
And this is a book characterised, a book arising out of silence and out of gaps. And even the way that it's set out on the page, there's a lot of white space on the page. It's beautifully done. And so our eyes are absolutely drawn to those gaps, to those silences. That it's a kind of ... in white, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Which, again, that's coming from a poetry place, if you like, because I'm used to always kind of resisting and tussling with white space, with the margins.
Yeah.
So that idea of the white space being a generative space for the story I was trying to tell seemed to me to work.
Yeah, absolutely it does. And as you say, it gives her a kind of economy of language and economy of space, because she has these constraints whenever she speaks, which we're hardly aware of, but it just gives her a different register to your voice, your narrator voice.
Yes, that's what I was after, yeah, exactly.
And what I love about it is that you are directly in dialogue with her. You address her in the present tense a lot of the time, don't you? So there is this sense that you are impelling her to speak, and we watch you create her. We watch you imagine her into being, with all the kind of caveats in your head of, you know, is this transgressive? Is this okay? Is this just crazy? You know. And then this voice emerges, the sonnet voice, which is so lovely and so wry, and she's so wonderfully down to earth.
That's the thing, because I didn't hit that right from the start.
Really?
So she was inclined to be really nice at the start. You know, I'd ask her a question. She'd give me a great answer with loads of information that I had gotten from all these other books about emigration or the famine or whatever it was. Oh, well, there was no shutting her up. And then I thought, this is no good. This is no good at all. So I thought, okay, come on, what else? What other tone could she take that might work better here? And I thought, I want her, and I swear I could almost see her. I want her to be sitting there, and I imagine her, I won't do it because of the mic, I imagine her with the arms folded across the chest, and she's sitting back, and she's basically saying, knock yourself out, kiddo, I'm giving you nothing. And so that's, the minute I kind of got that, I thought, now I believe in her myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now I believe in her. She's sarcastic and she's resistant and she's belittling of me at times as well. I mean, a Freudian would really go to town on this, because obviously I'm generating all of this myself. But anyway, we'll allow for that. But I think that resistance to me kept the project alive, because I've already said, you know, as a poet, every time you write something, it's new. You know, if you're a fiction writer, you're stuck with the same characters, the same plot, most of all the same tone, and I just don't have the patience for that.
Not to put any novelists off. You know, it's all right to write fiction if you have to.
If you really have to, but to keep it really, it got interesting for me when I had to negotiate the fact that she was resistant, but I still had to get information out of her. And so there's times when she's forthcoming, like when she's talking about her own past, she's more forthcoming. Like, you know, her parents and that world that she left, she's quite generous. But then when she starts talking about her marriage or her kids and things, it's like you can feel an obstacle. And she's kind of immediately saying, mind your tone now, young lady.
but you also use her beautifully and with great humour to dramatise some of the kind of dilemmas that we have in our heads as biographers, the sort of voice of our subject going, I wasn't like that at all, you know. Yeah. And the bigger sort of existential questions that we wrestle with what we're balancing, what we do with the past, what we do with fact. Yeah. Can I just read a little bit that I love, which is page 31 to 32, which is your voice and then her kind of answering you in her sonnet. It's where you've just decided that she is one of these 15 Ellens that you find travelling to... Oh, no, it's 5 Ellens, I think, isn't it, that you find, or 3, travelling from Ireland to New York, who are all 19 years old. They could all be her. Yeah. And you decided you're going to go for this particular one and you're going to give her a relation to travel with her because you don't want her to be lonely. So she is this Ellen with someone called Kath, who you've also found in the passenger lists. With one character, I allow myself to believe I'm listening in receiver mode, but with 2 and a setting, the beginnings of plot, I can hear the machine of my own invention whirring. I am making it up, no doubt about it, and I find I enjoy them, these liberties I grant myself and these liberties I take. Is it generous or dangerous, this wild imagining? I love that line. For my part, I don't know. I sit in a library office surrounded by the facts of the world and not a few likewise imaginings. Which, I wonder, tells more truth? In the offices beside mine are a biographer, a political scientist, a historian, and a novelist. I am poet in the middle, tossing up facts into the air that fall again as conjecture, as confetti-like detail. Is this dishonest? Is it presumptuous? Does it dishonour your life and all your lives, having no way to gauge the full span of its inaccuracy? But the facts are tombstones, dead-end truth. And the facts make so little room for a space we might call Ellen or Kath, so briskly do they pass over the milling immigrants in that room. The facts, despite all their minute and scrupulous attention, incline to the general, and the general interests me as backdrop only. Rightly or wrongly, I want to select one body from the throng, yours, and observing carefully, to draw first an outline, then to infill colour and shade, and to make of them an intimating life. And then immediately, just as I'm thinking, gosh, there's about 10 essay titles in that lot, discuss so many interesting things, we get the sonnet. And she comes in with, haven't you a powerful imagination all the same, she says. You'd swear you were there. She has returned, unbidden, carrying an empty birdcage she doesn't bother to explain. What a wonderful, there's the birdcage for no reason whatsoever. But biography is like that, isn't it? There are things you can't explain. There is this kind of constant, not anxiety, but difficulty of knowing, feeling like we were there. It's almost as if we were there, yep. But we weren't. Yep. And we're very likely to be missing the point at any given moment. And is it transgressive? Is it dangerous? Is it courageous? Yeah. Where are we in relation to these facts? And what do we do with the kind of tombstone facts? How do we animate this person?
That's it,
and then
exactly.
They turn up with a birdcage and judge us. Utterly glorious.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, I did every bit of research I could have done. I could say I was exhaustive in terms of doing what I could do. But I still have no idea if any of what I wrote is right. So in particular about Ellen, so I know that the stuff that I wrote about the general lot of domestic servants is right. I know because I use primary sources, and this is why it was so important for me to include, like the history piece that I quoted. It was really important for me to include history quotes to show that I wasn't pulling it all out of the air. Mm-hmm. And also to acknowledge the research of other people, so that I wasn't trying to pretend like, I actually went off by myself and analysed the archives of the Emigrant Savings Bank to find out what a servant typically earned every week. It's only if somebody else has done that work, then obviously you have to acknowledge it. So there's a lot of stuff in there that is true, and then the stuff about Ellen, maybe not. I don't know. It's true in one sense, without necessarily being correct.
But you signal it so carefully all the time, in ways that don't get in the way. We can kind of clumsily say, one might assume that, if he'd looked up at that moment, he might have seen, etc. But you do it in a way that is so smooth and so elegant and respectful that we don't stumble over it, and that's a very fine balance to strike.
Well, you see, Ellen's story was kind of remarkable in this respect, and maybe only in this. I mean, so much of her life was typical, but what wasn't typical was something I found out in my research looking at passenger lists. So I knew when her two children were born. I knew their names just from my mother telling me about her Uncle Jimmy and her own mother Annie. I knew their names, and I had a broad sense of when they were born. So I went looking, and I found their birth records. And then I looked on passenger lists, and I don't even know why I was looking on passenger lists after that. I have no idea why I started looking, but I found Ellen and the two kids heading back to Ireland when the kids were very small. And I thought, okay, I suppose my question before I went looking was, I wondered, did she ever bring them home? And then I found that she brought them, but the husband didn't go. He wasn't on the list. Well, that might be one thing and it might be another. But then I keep looking and I find that 3 weeks later she goes back on her own. And that was a lot of looking at passenger lists, I can tell you, and they're not always that legible, but that hit me like a sledgehammer. And I keep looking for years and years and years, and I find a confirmation certificate from the parish church for Jimmy when he was 12. So he was there between the ages of 2 and the ages of 12 in Sligo. And then he goes back just before the outbreak of the war. Actually, the two kids go back. So for all that time she was without them. Now you start thinking about that, and that's where my poetry self kind of helped as well. Yeah. So my researcher self wasn't going to help me to tell that story. And the only way I could imagine what it might feel like is to draw on poetry's capacity for feeling and thinking at the same time, and this idea of a woman who probably spent those years putting by, getting ready, wanting to bring them back, being a bit jealous that her mother has them and she doesn't, being lonely for them, no sign of the husband, so presumably she's on her own working, and so that's where the poetry part of me was able to I was able to draw on that, if you like. But I mean, that's an extraordinarily emotive story that comes in just bare facts. It's just names on passenger lists.
And there are moments like that that are heartbreaking, where you leave a respectful distance, because one of the difficulties with this approach is that everything is within bounds, isn't it? You can go anywhere if you're imagining your character, imagining their voice. You're not limited by fact or being accountable. But there are moments like that where you say, I can't go here. I don't know what that parting was like. I'm not even going to try and imagine how she said goodbye. And that, the absence of that imagining is tremendously powerful, because it would have been a little bit mawkish, perhaps, to imagine the tearful parting and watching till they go out of sight as the boat leaves, or whatever it was. And you just leave it with one sentence.
Yeah, I did. I really wanted it not to be sentimental. Yeah. There's one part, it's quite close to the end of the book, where it is a little sentimental. There's a sonnet in there where I talk about all the Ellens and all this money that they sent back, and how their own lives suffered for the lack of the money that they were sending back by way of remittances. And it is a little sentimental. That one sonnet,
we're allowed a bit. Yes.
Well, I think I tried to limit it to that. But wait till I tell you a funny thing. So I was telling my sister about this fact that I'd found, that Ellen's 2 children, that she'd brought them home and she'd left them in Ireland, and presumably because she'd been deserted by the husband, which was not uncommon. Again, I did a lot of research on Irish marriages amongst the immigrant communities, and I won't go into the reasons why, but it wasn't uncommon. And I was telling my sister about this whole thing, and she said, "Oh yeah, I knew that."
How would it taken you to find that out?
A long time.
Marvellous.
Yeah. It's funny the things, what people know, what you assume they know, what you assume they don't know, all that pool of little bits and pieces of knowledge.
Extraordinary. And you talked about money, or the money being sent back. And there are, there may be a tiny bit of sentimentality, but I'm not even sure I could have spotted it. But there are also a lot of very unsentimental transactions going on, because ultimately the reason why Ellen is in New York, along with thousands and thousands of other Irish, usually single young women, being sent out to work 6.5 days a week, ridiculously long days, to send money back to subsidise the farms and help pay the landlord in Ireland. And so money is enormously important, isn't it?
It is. It's the key to the whole story. It is the key to the whole story. And that was the thing that you begin to get a bit angry when you're reading it, because you think nobody ever talks about these women. Nobody ever talks about the fact that modern Ireland was built on the hours of really hard work, was built on the backs and the hands and the legs of these women who just worked and worked and worked and kept sending money back. And I kept thinking about, because it was the girls and one brother in Ellen's family who left out of the 12. Boys stayed back, so the boys would have benefited. And there must have been a point where they didn't really need the money anymore, but it was kind of nice to get it. And I thought, there's a story here about of necessity, but then maybe a point after which it becomes a kind of an expectation.
Doesn't she have 5 sisters
Yes.
going out with her
Yeah,
by
yeah,
the end?
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's a lot of...
That's a lot of envelopes going back the way.
Yeah.
It's a lot of envelopes. And, one of the most poignant facts I discovered was that if an emigrant girl sent back a letter that didn't have money in it, it was called an empty letter. Isn't that extraordinary?
Yeah,
nothing that she had to say was worth as much as the money. And times were really, really hard. But after various land acts, things got a little better. The rents came down. There was more security for tenant farmers. It wasn't as bad in 1910 as it was in 1885. It just wasn't, But still the money. And the figure, Arnold Schreier, who's an economist. So, it's hard to put an exact figure on this because Ireland, of course, was part of the UK, so we can't tell exactly which money was going back to Ireland, which money was coming back to England. Right? It's a little hard to tell that. But Arnold Schreier, who was an economist in the 1950s, had a book about remittances, and he said, and this seems to be a well-respected figure, the aggregate sum of remittances amounted to an annual average return of at least $5 million, or a grand total of $260 million in the period from 1848 to 1900.
That's a huge figure.
$260 million. That's not adjusted for inflation. That's the money orders. That's the money orders being sent back. So
and how is that acknowledged? Because there has been a lot of historical work which you draw on and quote
in America
of this period.
Yeah, not in Ireland.
And interesting.
There's no statue. There's no acknowledgement to these women. It doesn't get talked about. I've never heard anybody say we owe a debt of gratitude to these women for the work that they did, for the contribution that they made to modern Ireland. And that's tenuous, but I still can't believe that I'm wrong about this. And nobody said to me, I'm not making a big drama, nobody said to me, oh, you're wrong about this, but I have this idea. So the great waves of emigration in the 19th century, and then the land acts in the 1870s, 80s, 1890s, and the first years of the new decade offered relief to farmers. So then comes, in the teens of the last century, comes the independence movement. And I'm thinking, okay, but if you're really worried about how you're going to feed your children, you're probably not that preoccupied with independence movements. I think the independence movement at that stage really kicked in Ireland because there was a little bit of financial security that hadn't been there before that. Where did that financial security come from?
People like Ellen.
Sending back money, so that all the money to pay the rent, the money to pay the grocery bills and so on didn't have to come from the produce of these tiny small holdings in really bad land. There was money, there was actual money coming in the house. It's controversial. Like Pádraig Cullman, for example, said, it was James Connolly who said, do you know what? The remittances were really bad for Ireland because if there hadn't been all this money coming back from America, then farms would have modernised, they would have consolidated, they would have modernised. But that's a hard line to take, because how would they have done that? It would have required an awful lot of suffering and punishment, really.
Yeah. So
So
this book really is their monument, isn't it? And what's so interesting, because you have this paucity of fact about Ellen herself, it isn't a book about one person. Ellen is an every woman. And you tread a really interesting line between keeping her quite blurred and being very precise about her and imagining this very precise voice. So she is able to stand as a monument to all these women, to all this sacrifice and all this hard work.
Yeah. Well, she was one of 5 sisters, and they were like six young women out of, as you say, hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands of women who went over and tread this path of getting off at Castle Garden, getting through, and signing straight up for work as a domestic servant, and being sent off places. And you know, there wasn't a huge welcome for them, to be honest, but that was the labour that there was. Later on, there was other labour available, and at that stage, there wasn't as many Irish people coming. And we know that's a different story, and it's a story I have no purchase on, but we know that that demographic changed entirely. But at this time, there was so many of these young women, and that's what characterised emigration from Ireland, actually, was that most immigration to the United States tended to be family groups, except for Ireland, where the immigrants coming to the United States from Ireland were young single people, very often just like late teens, in fact, because they were being exported.
You do a wonderful job of giving us a sense of what that life would have been like without knowing exactly what Ellen's life was like, but the sense of whether or not she was isolated within that community, just that how few hours a day you weren't working, how insular your life would have been, and what those working conditions were, and what the American response was to these poor women, which was deeply unpleasant.
It was. They were objects of ridicule. They were known as biddies, and there was music hall acts that, you know, were based on their stupidity and their clumsiness and their general unbiddableness, and so on. And there was cartoons in the magazines and sketches and all of that. Like they were figures of fun, really. But there was a great place called the Merchant's House, which is down around 4th Street, which has, I have an awful feeling it might have closed because they were really short of money and they weren't getting any funding, and I doubt that's changed lately. But it was, the Merchant's House is all set up as it was in about, I think it's about 1890. So it's got the kitchens all the way up to the maids' rooms at the top. And they use census records to work out who the maids were at any given time. Should they all have Irish names, you know? But that was so atmospheric.
Was that very helpful, just being in that
really
space?
Really helpful.
So there's
really.
A lovely photo of it.
Yeah, there is. And, you know...
That's very evocative.
They said, oh, use it for free.
Great.
No, which it was fairly uncommon, but that was an extraordinary place to be there. And just, I swear, like, there was a feeling from it. There was a feeling.
And what about objects or giving her props? And they all have to work very hard in the absence of albums of photos or reams and reams of letters. Things work hard in this, don't they? Tell me about some of those.
Well, that's probably coming from my poems as well, because I get very interested in objects and in the significance of objects and the significance we confer upon them and the ones that are integral, etc., etc. Houses, furniture, so on and so forth. So I found it sneaking in, and then I thought, you know what, it adds texture. Like the bird cage, it never gets answered. You know, you just give her random things, and then suddenly, see, the thing about those things is that when you're given them as a reader, then you visualize them. And that's like an invitation to the reader. And if the reader accepts that invitation and does visualize them, they're in. Yeah, so when you give her a certain kind of clothing or a certain hat or a bag or whatever, it is, as well as kind of evoking something to do with the character, it is also a kind of a sly invitation to the reader, because that whole thing of visualizing that's how, you know, once a reader does that, they are committed. Yeah.
And you give us just enough to be able to do that, leaving us space as well. But also one of the interesting things about objects that we have from the past is that they don't always render up their stories. You know, we don't know what the significance of the bird cage is, and this watch that we have on the front cover, you believe, for good reasons that you set out, may have come from Ellen. But you don't know that.
I don't know that.
And that's kind of part of it, isn't it? It's part of these gaps, part of these silences, that sometimes the object will be a portal to the past.
That's right.
Other times it won't.
Well, sometimes it's a lie. For example, I went to the Tenement Museum in New York, and the guide there showed us the furniture. There were some very small chairs. And she said, people often say when they look at those chairs, oh, were people smaller back then? Of course, they weren't smaller back then. But these are the chairs that survived because nobody sat on them because they were too small. So we look at them, we think, oh, okay.
It was too uncomfy.
Yeah, but there's a trick that history is playing on us.
So why do things survive and others don't?
Yeah. Usually because they're less useful, whereas we think they're the things that have survived because they're the most important things, but not necessarily so.
Absolutely. And the kinds of things that would have been important to her are not the sort of things that would survive. They would be the workaday things and things that would be used over and over again.
Yeah.
So that the privilege of history of objects, the great instruments survive because people look after them. The beautiful antiques survive. Yeah. Not necessarily, whatever the things were that Ellen would have surrounded herself with. Yeah.
And I don't think she ever had much money to be buying, nice things or any of that. I think, if I'm right about the watch, it was a present that she gave to her firstborn grandchild, who was my mother. So it was a significant occasion. But, there's no sense, it's not like that somebody says to me, oh, I have such and such of Ellen's, or after the book got published, I had somebody write to me and say, I'm like a third cousin and I have some photographs of my parents and there's a woman I never identified and I wonder if it's Ellen. And I said, please, please, please look and send me a picture. But they never contacted me again.
Oh, no.
So,
But the thing is, what if it had been Ellen and she looked nothing like our sense of Ellen? Would that, in a way, I'd rather you didn't find out.
Yeah, well, she'd have the last laugh, which is, I think is probably
some
appropriate.
Huge Mohican or something. Absolutely shocking. Just going back to letters and what you do have, which, as you say, is very little.
Yeah.
One of the things that you have to do, as you say, is to create her voice, because we don't have her voice. And ordinarily you would have so much more of your subject's voice if you were about to embark on a biography. But there is a moment that's particularly poignant where there are letters that aren't sent and communication that doesn't happen. Yeah. So you've got a kind of double silencing that you're playing with very beautifully.
Yeah. So that came from life, that story. Yeah. So the story is that so my mother, as I've already said, had lived with her grandmother, and then they're going back to Ireland. And so the question is, well, do we leave her there with Ellen, or do we take her with the other kids and her parents? Well, they take her, and she's really heartbroken. And I have a photograph of my mother on the deck of the ship that she sailed home on, and there's two women with those large fur coats and hats, kind of jaunty hats and things, and she had begged them. They were going to Ireland as well, and she said, when you're going back to America, because they were only on a holiday, will you come and take me? And they said, yeah, we'll call for you. And she sat by the window like for weeks waiting for them to come, and of course they never did. So she was absolutely heartbroken, thinking about her grandmother, whom she really dearly loved, back on her own in New York. And her mother, so my grandmother, thought that the best, and I'm sure she had very good intentions, but she thought the best thing to do in that situation was, rather than the wound opening, like every couple of weeks with a new letter being sent or a new letter being received, that the best thing to do was to store up the letters that my mother's grandmother sent back to her and not to give them. And
quite a decision, isn't it?
It's quite a decision, and I'm sure she meant it for the best, but
it's complicated, isn't it?
It is complicated.
As you say, this awful rift, the 10-year gap where your mother had no contact with her mother. Yeah. Is there resentment there? Is there? I mean, where does that come from?
Yeah. And remember that my mother's mother, so my grandmother, had been left in Ireland with her grandparents by her mother. So I think it was, there is this kind of this cross-hatch of sorrowful stories that is part of an emigrant's tale, really, But my mother told me that the letters got burned.
Did they?
Yeah.
So she never saw them?
She never saw them. And that image to me of the letters being burned and of the smoke going up in the chimney and being blown out of the chimney and blown westwards, I imagined, seemed to me like the best way of resolving that story. Yeah. Rather than trying to understand all the hurt and the you know, whatever was going on in somebody's mind who had suffered quite a bit herself in life, that the best thing to do was let an image resolve the story insofar as it could. So again, that was my poetry.
Which is a lovely and very poignant example of what poetry can bring to biography. And I know, you know, we've talked about turning to the sonnet form to create the voice, this sort of thing. But is there something that poetry has to offer biography that you can theorize out of this wonderful experiment?
I'm a little hesitant to do that in a way because I don't have the answer.
It's a big question.
It's a big question, and I think I'm probably better off saying maybe. I mean, it kind of depends on the poetry as well. Yeah. I mean, because, you know, not all poetry is
as good as yours?
No, I don't want to say that. But some of it is too documentary. I think that's what I want to say. Not all of it is reserved enough, I think, to honour the silences and the holes and the absences in the story. Yeah. Some of it, I think, is too headlong. It wants to run in and join everything up and fill in everything. It's too documentary. And so that kind of poetry won't work for it.
Okay.
So I think it has to have a certain tone. Like if you can imagine somebody kind of coming to this with a performance poetry mentality, then they will animate all of it, as opposed to saying, you know, there are places where I don't know. There's places that I'm never going to know. Yeah. So I think that kind of self-checking and a sort of respect for reserve and a respect for silence that's probably a better strategy for this kind of a project than maybe any other kind of poetry, perhaps.
So poetry gives you a license to explore within the gap, but you have to be aware of the fact that you are in a gap. There is something
very definitely
inherently transgressive, as well as creative.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. But what it's good at doing, poetry, what I found it really helpful for was for wrapping up a story. Like I finished the whole book with a story of looking out from my window onto Fifth Avenue and just seeing snow falling and just imagining Ellen standing out there looking up, you know, when the library was built. And it's an image. It's just an image. But I thought, do you know what? As an image, rather than finishing with history or with facts or with numbers or any of that, as an image, it does everything that I need it to do. And so that reliance on imagery, I think, is something that I found really helpful in putting together the book and in getting out of scenes as well, because it's quite, you know, the scenes there is a narrative of her life running through it, but, you know, this one is domestic service, this one is going back home, this one is the boarding house, etc., etc. And then there's that kind of odd section that you kind of mentioned earlier, which is where I look at 15 other Ellens. And I call it Not My Ellens, because obviously when you're trying to find out about somebody, you find out lots about other people of similar names, and sometimes you think, oh, that's her. Oh, look, she was living on this street in the 1910 census. Oh, look, she's got 18 children. Oh, no, she doesn't, because I know my mother told me that there were 2 children. So there's all these other Ellens.
Yeah, which is utterly fascinating, and I love that that's in there as well, because you're kind of bringing us into the experience of being in the archives, of just looking through these names and finding the names. She's written as Ellen Geary or Dreary or something, and because her name's misspelt in lists. And is it this Ellen who gets blown up in a subway accident, or is it this one who becomes some member of minor local government, or you know, just the kind of counterfactual, this could have been her life, this could have been her life. Yeah. And quite often you genuinely don't know whether one of them is your Ellen or not.
And that's why if I didn't have the small little bits of knowledge from life, I would have found it a harder book. I mean, I didn't have much, really. You know, my mother died in 1994, so I wasn't able to go back to her and say, oh, can I just check this with you? But I had enough to be able to help me. I knew there wasn't 12 children or etc.
But it helps build this picture of her being the every woman, of her being one of many hundreds of thousands, that here's another load of Ellens she could have been. It's lovely to have all those
more
shadowy
lucky
figures.
Or less lucky, like some of them are very tragic comeuppances,
Wonderful. I suppose I'd like to end going back to that image you just referred to, the snow falling or the smoke of the letters that were never read. That I think for me, the two things that I take away from this book are the silences and how creatively you approach them, but how respectfully you also back away from them and just hold them for us. Yeah. But also the kind of vertical element of this, the earthbound, the historical quotes, the statistics, and then the idea of something so ethereal and so ephemeral as smoke or snow, and that perhaps that, if we were to theorise it, seeing as we are in an Oxford college, but if that's what you as a poet can bring to these tombstone facts, as you call them, these sort of dead-end facts, which we need, and we need to know these things, and they work, and they're important. But you also have this wonderfully poetic snow, smoke, whatever it is, and the two together gives us a way of framing silence, which is really extraordinary.
Well, that's it, and because we don't remember in straight lines.
No.
And we do sometimes remember in these odd snatches of images, and we're not even quite sure we intellectually understand them. But they're part of it as well. They're part of how we tell stories, is we have a colour in our mind, or we have a scent in our mind, or, something that isn't capturable in words.
And if we are going to go away with anything from tonight, it is to give ourselves, as biographers, permission to think not in straight lines, but to be able to hold those little glimpses, those moments, along with the facts.
Yeah.
So thank you for allowing us to do that.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We have time for some questions, if anybody would like to. Yes.
I have a question. I'm really fascinated about writing about family. You spoke about your sister, and the fact that your sister knew something that you didn't know. Or do you find yourself still free to tell the whole story as you see it, or do you feel like you need to ask family as part of your narrative to...
Little of both. So I wrote it as though nobody was ever going to read it, except me.
Yeah.
And then after I had it written, and I have to say it was 3 times this size, and I had to decide that's not actually relevant, and I'm only putting it, spent 3 months researching it, but after I had it written and edited, I gave it to my eldest brother and my eldest sister and another brother, and I said, you read it and tell me if you've got a problem with anything here. And if you do, we'll talk about it. I wouldn't promise necessarily that I would change it, but if you see something that is gravely wrong, we'll talk about it. And they came back and said, no, it's fine. It's fine. And we don't have a problem with any of it. I suppose it's easy for them to do that because it's not about them. If it was a memoir of my immediate family, it might be a different story.
Enough removed.
Yeah. Just abstracted enough. Yeah.
Any others? Hermione.
This is so wonderful. In the history of all these hundreds and thousands of women.
Yep.
Sorry.
Going to America from Ireland, sometimes coming back, sometimes going back again. Are there any rival narratives? Are there any documents? Are there any collected letters? Are there any diaries? And I'm wondering what the level of literacy is too within this very large, complex community.
Yeah,
I wondered whether you read some other sources or there weren't any.
That's a really good question. So the first thing to say is that English was their second language. So their first language and the language they would have spoken at home would have been Irish. But they would have been schooled in English. So they had Irish, they had English, and they might even have had a little bit of Latin, in truth, depending on who was teaching them, but that wasn't unheard of. Okay. So they were not uneducated. And they were being educated for the export market, which is kind of tragic as well, but they were. That's why they were taught English. That and other reasons, but so there are letters. There are there's a really good book that was edited by David Fitzpatrick called Oceans of Consolation about emigrant letters to and from Australia. Now, there isn't anything as good as that in terms of the United States. You know what? They were really busy, was the first thing to say. But I did read a novel that I managed to get through the New York Public Library. It was from about 1888, and it was a domestic servant talking about her life, but it was a novel, and I got so excited when I got hold of it. It was the most boring book I have ever read, because she was just like, and then we did this, and then we did that, and then we cleaned the floors, and then we cleaned the floors again because the dog had walked over them, and it never got going as a narrative, because that wasn't in the skill set. And also, they were coming from an oral culture. And I think all the drama would have been around the table, like with Eleanor, would have been around the table with her sisters when they met. And I think that the letters that they sent back would have been quite formulaic. And they would have been just the big news events, and they wouldn't have been thoughts and feelings. But I do have a scene where I imagine them around the table and they're kind of lapsing back into Irish and things. But I think I wasn't able to find any body of letters that were sent back. There's scraps here and scraps there, and they're quite. I did look up newspapers from the time as well, and I got this fantastic fact from somebody in the Boston Globe or the Herald, talking about having spoken to cashiers in banks, and he said that most of the money that came through his hands was small change, small money from servant girls. And I thought, well, there we are. I knew it. I did know it, because the way that men earned money was different, because they were out on the roads or the railroads, and they were with gangs of other men, and money didn't get saved in quite the same way. Mm-hmm. But when you had a roof over your head as a servant and no expenses as such, everything you earned, which wasn't much, but if you earned it, it was savable. So I knew that would be the case. But there are these odd little things that I found that are like interviews, that are contemporary interviews of people that gave me nuggets, that gave me snippets, but not a huge tranche of letters. No, unfortunately. There's a fantastic archive of the Emigrant Savings Bank, and I really thought I'd find Ellen there. I really thought that she might have had an account there. I couldn't find her.
But just going back to this idea of language, and that English is her second language, you use that quite frequently. The words and new words take on a lot of significance because they represent the world of home or the new world, along with objects. So the words are working with objects. And there's a bit that I love, and just the second half of one of her sonnets, where she's on the boat for the first time, going to New York. And you have her say, "Many the thing I saw new to me, teeth that came out at night, a blind boy who'd wink at girls, a dead baby, twins, and a man who'd draw your likeness if you'd kiss him later by the stairs, which I did not. Someone had a squeeze box. A girl with hair down past her waist gave us the harp that once, and after it was silence but for waves on the hull like a fist on a bodhrán. New words I had no meaning for. Embark, knots, electric, stairs, all in a mess of accents, so you didn't know where you were." I love the idea of not knowing where you are anyway because you're in the middle of the Atlantic, but that the language locates and also dislocates, as well as objects and things that she sees.
Yeah. And the word that was strongest to me, that I reckoned she would never have heard as much of as before getting on that ship, was Ireland. I mean, when you're growing up, you don't use the name of the country you're from very much. And I thought, okay, she's going to hear that non-stop.
It's going to become somewhere foreign, isn't it? It becomes somewhere other.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Alison.
Thank you. Thank you, Vona. There's so much going on there. And I'm very struck by your God, I'm lapsing into an Irish accent. I'm so sorry. As you know, I'm married to somebody from County Mayo and elsewhere, but I'm struck by your subtitle, and I have an observation and a question. One is, the observation is maybe these generic labels don't do us that much good now, in that, you know, if we insert the word memoir between biography and poetry, and then we start looking at all the many different varieties of biography, from the most sketchy to the most factual, if you like. There are so many ways in which people are writing narratives and evoking lives between history and memory.
Yep.
You know, and I just think we're all maybe in this room dealing with those oscillations differently.
Yeah.
I remember somebody saying to me when I was writing family history, the asterisk is your friend, which I found very helpful, you know, as a way of signaling the point at which you can't go, or the italics are very useful to a writer to signal that you're doing a different kind of thing, you know, in an opening to a chapter and so on. So I just wanted to sort of put that in, because all these ways of telling, using imagery, using suggestive facts, which aren't always tombstones, you know, I think people have a huge range of possibilities. So that's a kind of an observation. The other is a straightforward question. What did you do about religion? And I'm asking partly because I do know some of the stories of Irish women coming here much later, after the First War, and the relationship to the church, you know, was in a sense almost the most central, particularly if they were on their own. Sometimes in terms of sending money too, but you know, what you as presumably a rather different kind of woman to your great-grandmother did about that. Did you feel you wanted to go into the communal world of the church or deal with it, or faith and so on?
Yeah, I did to an extent. So, not being a believer myself, I didn't want to give too much room to that. But I imagine that if you were a believer, I imagine, but also I know. So the thing I imagined was that it must be a comfort. So you're lying in the bed, you're far away from home, you're lonely, homesick, tired, in a way that you might never have been tired before. That idea that you're being minded, being cared for in some way, must be a great comfort. But in a more practical way, how they socialized was through the church, was through their parish. Yeah. So, and there's a lot of work being done on this, on social dances that were held by the, you know, in the parish, and fairs that were held as fundraisers for, I mean, you know, what's that big church on Fifth Avenue? That's built by contributions from Irish immigrants. So, you know, they were an integral part of what was happening at parish level. But there's some good photographs of the social dances that are in the Library of Congress in Washington. And, you know, it was just like, you're working 6.5 days a week. So your only chance of meeting somebody that you might potentially marry is you've got half a day to do it. So
it's a Sunday morning. That's mass, isn't it?
It's mass, and then it's something you're already there. So you're at the church. So there'll be something else that would help you with that. Because I mean, that was the plan, if you like, was that these people wouldn't live on their own and die without issue. The idea was you build Irish America. So the church did actually sort of provide these social opportunities under supervision, of course, and within the strictures allowed. But it was a big thing. The parish work was a big thing, actually. And so I imagine that for these young women, it was a kind of a personal comfort, but it was also a practical network. And a way of meeting somebody else they'd probably meet somebody from home, but they wouldn't meet him otherwise unless they had some place to go to where they'd feel safe going to.
Yes.
did you find yourself rambling over and looking at the Italian immigrant experience when you were working on this project?
You know, I was mindful of the fact that I could go a lot of different places. And I went out to Ellis Island and I took the Hard Hat tour. And the Hard Hat tour is really recommended to anybody. It's to all the buildings that you don't get to see, you know, on the normal tour. And so you see behind the scenes, and you see the morgue, and you see the places where people were isolated and because they had various diseases and so on. And then I began to think, this is one subset of immigrants, and there's so many more. You know, there's all the Scandinavians, there's the Germans, there's the Italians, there's the Eastern Europeans. Do you know what I mean? And there was English people emigrating as well, and finding work as kind of better paid, but still household staff, but better paid. They tended to be more like, you know, nurses as opposed to, you know, cleaning floors. But I was mindful that I needed to define my terms, really. So I had 9 months, and I had a hell of a lot of work to do in the 9 months. So it really, you know, I was there from early in the morning until I was kicked out in the evening. There wasn't any bandwidth for me. And also, as I say, it was so much bigger because I had all these other issues as well, apart from even what's in the book. Like, one of the things I could never figure out, why did the O'Haras not buy their land out under the Land Act as so many other farmers did? Why did that not happen? And so I spent a long time trying to figure out why that didn't happen. And I had like 80 pages on that, and that was one I just thought, you know what, that just has to go. It's not relevant to the story. The story's fine without it. And you know, the funniest thing, I saw in my little town in South Sligo, somebody put a notice up in the supermarket that they would repair jewellery. And I had a couple of bits and pieces, and I said, I'll go around to your man. And he wasn't there, but his wife was there. They're from South Africa. His wife was there, and I admired her cottage. It's kind of what I would have done in my cottage if I'd had a bit more sense. I said, oh, it's lovely. And she said, oh, yes. She said it was, we bought it from a man called Bertie O'Hara. And I said, that's very odd, because I know that Ellen's mother, she didn't grow up there in that place, but she's buried in the field next door in the little cemetery. And I thought, I think after the summer, I think what happened was they got better land. Their own land was kind of rubbishy. It's very picturesque, but it was rubbish land. I think they got an offer of a better farm, and she moved over to Kilmactygue, and that's why she died there and was buried next door. And I half suspect that the jeweller's house was maybe the house that she had lived in. But you know, this is a funny world.
It's all for the sequel.
I never had a notion of buying a house in Sligo. I didn't know any of this story. I bought my house 6 months before I went looking for the story, and then found out that Ellen's childhood home was 5 miles out the road.
Extraordinary.
You do wonder sometimes.
You were meant to write it.
You do wonder, yeah, like all these linkages, yeah.
Well, I think we should stop there, with it being divine providence that you wrote this book, and have a glass of wine in the cafe outside. Thank you all very, very much. We had intended to have books for you to be able to buy, because, as I say, we cannot recommend this enough. It's the most wonderful book. But there's been a tragic mix-up with the bookseller, who has received 1 copy this morning instead of the 20 that we had hoped. So huge apologies for that. For our Canadian friends, if it may be harder for you to get the book, so just drop us a note that you'd like one, and we'll order them for you. And if anybody else has any difficulty at all getting hold of the book, please email Oclu, and we will personally become booksellers for this post, because we're really frustrated that the books haven't come.
Maybe you could take the 1 copy and divide it.
Yes, I'll loan my copy around. You can all have a page each. But we do have wine, I hope. So let's go and see if that's there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kate. Thank you.